Okay, so I'm going to do about a 15-minute lecture on documentary storytelling. And you guys are all aware, you know this from your own film watching experience, that both narrative films, films that have actors, and documentary films, films in which people play themselves, have story arc and story elements that in many ways are very similar. And I've talked about this multiple times. I will continue to talk about it through the rest of the semester because it's just that important of a note to make. And so when you guys are constructing your films, make sure that you are telling stories, right? You see it all the time in news programs where there's a massive issue, and that massive issue, whatever it is, gets reduced down to the single person or the small group of people. So if they, for example, if CNN or MSNBC or Fox, one of the three, wanted to do a story on college educated women and how they'll vote in the upcoming election versus the last election, they would certainly show us some statistics and some maps. But the real way to engage viewers in that case is to meet an individual, maybe a woman who voted one way in 2016 and is voting differently in 2020, but somebody who themselves is really compelling, really interesting. I saw this yesterday on Apple News Plus where they did exactly this, but they wanted to dial down into a female business owner who was suffering from COVID and long duration COVID, not COVID where she got better quickly, but where she's now been sick for months and months, and is still really not much better. So again, that was a perfect example of how you tell these massive stories on the individual human level. And as you guys are becoming professional producers, you have to do it every single time. It has to be one really smart person's take on something, or one person that really lived something in an interesting way. But it's always more interesting and more compelling and more watchable to have that singular focus. So, okay, so let's think about that in regards to your films. And I would just ask you guys rhetorically, how are you doing that? How do you take your films out of, let's do a general movie about something that we're all suffering from, and how do we dive into one person's experience here? Maybe, for example, you look at a mother who's got three children who are now all learning remotely, and maybe the digital where it works for you guys really well, maybe it doesn't work for somebody who's 6 or 7 or 8, right? And so, instead of telling that whole story, you tell that one family's story. Okay, so let's move on to this. I think you guys understand that, and the challenge for you as producers is to do that, to find a single story and to focus on it. And even if it's a slightly shorter film, right? It's going to be a better film, a significantly better film with that focus. So the lesson is you don't need everything. You don't need to cast this encyclopedic look at everything. What's much better is to cast the focused, more narrow look and to tell it in in a way that is really compelling, right? And so I've talked for the last 5 minutes here about story, and certainly it has a story structure like every narrative film. There are dramatic stakes. There is a rising action where things get more and more intense as we go. There's some sort of climactic event, and then there's falling action where the characters in your film are dealing with the emotional fallout of whatever it was that they went through in this story arc. And then almost always you want to have a surprise or a shocking ending. I really like thinking about and talking about the film Waiting for Superman, which a lot of you might know, or some of you might have even experienced what that film is about. It's about a lottery system in which children in an inner city are either going to or are not going to get into a really highly functioning charter school in that system. So something like the Seed School in Washington, D.C. And we know from watching that film that if they don't get in, that their path is going to be significantly harder. And if they do make it in, if they win the lottery and they get the right number, it's not a merit based, it's a drawing. And in this film, if they do get in, we know that they might have the kind of support that they need in order to achieve and to thrive. And who knows, maybe end up in medical school, law school, Harvard, University of Maryland. Um, who's to say? So that film is really a brilliantly structured story arc because it's about these larger issues, right? It's about race and racism and institutionalized racism and opportunity and lack of opportunity. It's about luck. It's about perseverance, all those things, but it's all boiled down to these individual children where we are praying for them, right? We're praying, God, I hope this kid makes it into the movie. And that movie's really engaging because they're forcing us into this situation, right? They don't tell us at the beginning of the film who makes it, even though they know because they've shot the whole movie, right? They've been there with these families. They've watched it all the way through. They hold that back. And so at the very end of the film, we're emotionally invested. We care about all these people, the kids, their mothers, their fathers. And then we find out who got in and who didn't. And it's really emotionally impactful in the same way that a narrative film is, right? And so that's where the elements come into play. So I'm also interested in talking to you about video technique, actually writing things out, including voiceover and then editing technique. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to dive into all of these things. So video, we all know how to shoot with our cameras because we do it all the time. We shoot pictures, we shoot videos of our friends. We're getting to be better and better photographers just from the constant work at it. One of the things you want to be careful of is am I making a horizontal or a vertical film? And so some of you guys learned that in your group projects where some people were holding their films horizontally and some vertically. It's good to make that decision up front. I think when I saw that, the groups did a really nice job of either putting wings on the shot. It's where you fill the empty space with a blown up version of the image, or it's a 4K camera and you're making an HD movie, you can zoom right in and change the aspect ratio. But things to think about. Using the rule of thirds, which we haven't talked a lot about in this class. I talk about it more in cinematography, but we all know the rule of thirds. You guys have talked about it with Bob in the past. God bless his soul. Um, and the rule of thirds is just a really compelling way to engage somebody aesthetically in your movie. For whatever reason, it works. And for those of you guys that aren't aware, remember the rule of thirds is you put a tic-tac-toe grid on your image and you put the important parts of that image in the four nexus points where you're one third, one third, one third, and one third. There's 4 points where they cross. And we know from photography, from cinematography, that for whatever reason, when an image has something in one of those four nexus points, it's a more compelling image. I would also talk at this point about your audio. Make sure that you're getting clean audio that sounds good and also backup audio. So take a second phone, put it on the table, and record a voice memo so that no matter where your camera is in the room, you're getting really clean audio from this other audio source. And you can marry those two in editing by just matching the waveforms. It's very easy to do. It's a lecture that I do in 372. A lot of you should have seen that already, but it's 5 clicks and puts Adobe puts it together for you on a timeline and syncs it up. And it's just matching those shapes, and Adobe's good at matching shapes. Also, remember that we like to use 3-point lighting. I'm not really a fan of this. I have my ring light. I don't like how it creates this shadow here. So, if I'm shooting a documentary with this light, I'm probably, filling in maybe this space down here. I can't really see. I'm not looking at myself right now, but I know for a fact I don't like this lighting in this room that much. So if I was doing this for real, I probably would fill that space with some light. So something for you guys to think about, especially if you're working in teams. and those teams have multiple cell phones. Use one or two to shoot, use one to record backup audio, use another to maybe do some fill light. And I've even had students when I go out when I've gone out into the field with students, especially on the London trip, where I've just had them stand, with their cell phone just out of camera to fill in that space and create a really nice uh, lighting effect. Okay, so moving on to scripting, uh, we are going to do what is considered the traditional documentary scripting technique on this project for the rest of the semester. The first project was kind of get to know how to do it, make a film, have fun. Now we're going to do what you would do if you were at Discovery Channel working in one of their documentary units, right? Which is the goal. We've got a lot of students that have ended up there working on films, and there's no reason that you can't as well. What you do then when you're doing that kind of documentary scripting, and again, we'll work on this more later, is you are going to type up all of your answers to all of your questions. You put them into a script form, and you could use automatic transcribing software if you want, and then just fix it. So it's pretty easy to do. You're going to write out all of your voiceover scripts, which is you talking directly to the audience as a narrator, or some people want to do an experimental form where they don't do that. That's okay if you can justify it. And then you would have other characters talking to the audience as a form of kind of narrator. That's not the voice of God or the voice of Morgan Freeman, or they're both, right? They're the same person. Um, and then finally, editing technique. We know about all this. Do you use jump cuts? Do you not? Um, how are you pulling it together? Again, I think the most important thing about in editing is to think about how long your film should be. I often say to students, the better student films are 6 minutes or 7 minutes long, because when you go to 10 or 11 or 12, it's often, and not always, but it's often a sign that the filmmaker did not want to cut down stuff. And so they left in the less important material, and they hid the really important stuff in all of that extra wasted space. And so I say target 6 minutes on these films, because I have seen in the past where a 6 minute film would have been perfect, but they go to 8 or 9 because they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, or you had multiple people shooting and you didn't want to not include their material. So just be ruthless as well in the editing. And so what we have here in this elements list is an extremely organized shoot, right? Where everything is anticipated, multiple cameras, multiple recordings, everything is backed up, and then it's well written, it's clear, it's coherent, it tells a story, and it doesn't take an excessive amount of the audience's time. And that's how you create really um, grateful audience members. When you teach them something, you show them something, and they learn something. And so I'm gonna show you in next week's class in a pod lecture the film Black Sheep, which was an Academy Award nominated short film, and it's absolutely stunningly well made. And I think when you see that, you'll see, okay, here's where brevity really matters. Although that is a longer film, it's not 6, it's more like 15. And in that case, the story arc itself justified the longer duration. So the story is where you have to make that decision. Is this story compelling enough, unique enough that I can take that much of the audience's time? So I hope that's clear that that's what we're talking about for the rest of the semester. Okay, we all know what a story arc is. I just put it up on this slide because I wanted to talk about in documentary something called the tease. The tease tends to be how you introduce a really good documentary. So if you look at a film like Hoop Dreams, it's one of the great films ever made. It's a documentary about two middle school boys trying to make it ultimately into college basketball and in the pros. And they followed these two for 6 years plus college, really 7 years, and it's just one of the great films. Not only documentary, one of the great films of all time. Um, so find it, and watch it. If we were together, I would show it to you from my DVD, but it's available on streaming services as well. Um, so in that film, the tease is phenomenal. It's really well done. It's musical. It's fast cuts. It's beautiful shots. It's guys playing basketball. Great graphics. Older graphics. The film's from the late '80s, so they're not current graphics. They're older. But the tease itself ends on the beat with the music. Great shot. Great graphic. Title of the film. And that is how you do it, right? You build a tease that's not narrative. You're not doing your voiceover yet. You're not telling the audience what the issue is. You're showing them things visually. You're making it interesting, exciting. In a student film, maybe it's only 15 seconds, but it has the impact that you want. So the body of the film, moving on from the tease, the body of the film is where you present the conflicts, and usually you put them in some kind of order. Um, it could be from the smallest thing to the largest, like maybe if we're talking about the economic impact of COVID, right? And you talk about some guy out there that lost some money on the stock market, but is still able to eat and has a nice car and has a house. Who cares, right? Yeah, the guy lost a little bit of money in the stock market. We feel some sympathy. But compared to the family with children who lost their jobs, have no money, who aren't getting unemployment, that is really dramatic. And so, as we're looking at a story arc, the guy that lost a little money in the stock market would be here. The family who can't feed their children is here. And that's how you can understand rising action, where as we move through the film, as we progress, things should get more and more desperate in a really made documentary. Okay, so the conclusion comes after the climax, whatever that big event is. Um, Maybe it's the mother in this family going for a job interview and she doesn't get the job, right? So that's the climax of this short film. And the falling action is, what does she do next? Does she have to go get into a soup line? Does she have to go to a food pantry? Food stamps? I mean, what is next for her in that scenario? And then the resolution is whatever we see last. Maybe the last thing you show is the woman goes to the food pantry, she gets some food, she puts it on her table, and the last thing we see is the family together eating something. So we know that the human spirit will endure, and that at least for today they have food, and hopefully tomorrow things get better, right? And so that's how you interpret this diagram. Increasing conflict, things are getting more and more desperate, some kind of event in which nothing can go back from it, and then the falling response is what happens next. So again, I would ask you guys to think about your film structures and how you might fit into that structure. Okay, I talked about the tease. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but you can read this for yourself. Here's a documentary tease. You can see these in almost every documentary film. The beginning, minute, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, whatever, where it really is presenting the film in a compelling way. And then after the tease, we get into the body of the film, the main conflict, the narration. We get to know who the characters are. We learn their names. Usually, this is 80% of the movie. So if it's a 90-minute film, your tease might be 2 or 3 minutes. The body of the film might be 80, and the conclusion might be the last 5 or 6. That's how you want to think about these ratios. And then finally, the conclusion. You have to finish the story. You have to tell us what happened. You save the reversal for the end, right? You don't tell us that this mother in the previous hypothetical example doesn't get the job and is going to end up on at a food pantry. You don't tell us that in the first few minutes. You save it for the very end because we're following a structure that mimics movies, that mimics narrative movies, and not just documentary. Okay, I've already talked about all these things. I do talk in a lot of my filmmaking classes about the Hollywood technique, which is that you use an establishing shot before you move into the characters. So you guys can read this list for yourself, but some of the things to think about: how are you going to frame your subjects? I find that it's always best to frame my subjects, and I'll show you some of these examples in different lectures, but to frame my subjects so that in this case, we notice if we look at the rule of thirds, his body is on this lower one third axis, right? So that's a really compelling, nicely composed image. And the camera that he's shooting on is also fully along that lower one third axis. So that's a really composed shot according to kind of traditional documentary video technique. Now, I will say, and please listen to this: when you do multiple interviews, please remember that you want to have some interviews where the guest is on this side of the image and other interviews where the guest is on the other side of the image. And all you do is you put your camera here for some of the shots and stand here. And then for others, you put your camera here and stand here and always have the guest looking through the empty space at you. And what that does is that will allow you to have a more visually varied film. The last thing I'll say about video technique is never shoot against a wall, right? I have very deep focus in this room for a reason because it's just better looking. Never shoot against a wall. Always pull out from the wall and have some space where you could have some maybe some shallow focus, but never right up against that back wall. And you guys can read these slides for yourself. And again, I'll post this if you want to see this again. It'll be posted in the files tab. Okay, 3-point lighting I had mentioned already. I'll just remind you guys, with 3-point lighting, you have light coming from three sources: the main light, the fill light, and then a kicker or a backlight that's pulling me off the back wall. And so these puck lights above me are acting as a kicker or a backlight to separate my shoulder from what's back there. Okay, so that's it for this lecture on documentary storytelling. I'm going to stop the lecture now and I'll post it. And I would just ask you guys, as I'm stopping, if you have any questions.